Most people know that James Watson and Francis Crick discovered the structure of DNA in 1953. They built a model of the double helix. They won the Nobel Prize. They changed biology forever. That story is in every textbook, but the model they built came from data they never collected, from a photograph they were never supposed to see, from a woman whose name most people still do not know. Her name was Rosalind Franklin. She was a chemist at King's College London. She had a PhD from Cambridge. She was an expert in X-ray crystallography, which is a technique for figuring out the structure of molecules by shooting X-rays through them and analyzing the patterns. In January 1951, she was hired to work on DNA. The molecule everyone knew was important, but nobody understood yet. The director of the lab, a man named John Randall, sent her a letter. He told her she would be leading the DNA work. She had independent authority. That is what the letter said. Maurice Wilkins already worked at King's. He had been working on DNA before Franklin arrived. He thought Franklin was coming to assist him. Nobody told him otherwise. Randall never clarified who reported to who. He hired Franklin, gave her authority, and never informed Wilkins that the project structure had changed. So Franklin showed up thinking she was running her own research. Wilkins thought he was still in charge, and from day one, they could not stand each other. This was not personality. This was structural. King's College had a faculty common room where scientists talked after hours, shared ideas, built collaborations. Women were not allowed in. Franklin ate lunch alone. She was excluded from the informal networks where science actually happened in 1951. Wilkins saw her as uncooperative. She saw him as territorial. The truth is, Randall set them both up to fail and then walked away. Franklin got to work anyway. In May 1952, her graduate student Raymond Gosling took a photograph using a technique Franklin had developed. The image was labeled Photo 51. It showed DNA fibers in what is called the B form, which is the structure DNA takes when it is wet. The photo was the clearest X-ray diffraction image of DNA anyone had ever seen, and it showed something unmistakable, a cross pattern, an X shape in the diffraction. That pattern is the signature of a helix. If you know how to read X-ray images, and Franklin absolutely did, you know what that means. DNA was not a flat molecule. It was not a clump. It was a spiral, a helix. Franklin did not publish the photo right away. She was methodical. She wanted to verify the number of strands. She wanted to confirm where the bases were positioned. She wanted a full data set before making claims. That is how rigorous science works. You do not build a theory off one image. You confirm it 6 different ways. So she labeled Photo 51. She filed it. She kept working. She planned to come back to it once she had more evidence. She had no idea that photograph was about to be handed to her competitors. Wilkins had access to the lab. He worked in the same building. He considered the data part of the King's College project, not Franklin's project. The lab's project. He did not think of her as an independent researcher, even though that is what Randall had hired her to be. He thought of her as someone collecting data, a technician, not a theorist. That assumption, that quiet sexist assumption, is what made everything else possible. In January 1953, James Watson visited King's College. Watson was working with Francis Crick at Cambridge. They were trying to build a model of DNA. They had been stuck on a triple helix design, 3 strands, twisted together. It was wrong, but they did not know it yet. Watson was at King's for a seminar. Wilkins pulled him aside, and Wilkins showed him Photo 51, just showed it to him. No permission, no consultation. Franklin was not in the room. She did not know it was happening. Wilkins thought it was fine. Watson later wrote that seeing that photograph was the moment everything changed. Watson looked at the X pattern. He understood immediately. DNA was a helix, not 3 strands, 2. The photograph told him everything his model had been missing. He went back to Cambridge. He told Crick. They tore apart their triple helix and started over. And the foundation of what they built next was an image they had no right to see. That photograph belonged to Rosalind Franklin. She had created the technique. She had captured the image. She had interpreted the data. And she never knew it had been taken from her until it was already too late. Watson did not just have the photograph. He also had Franklin's written analysis, her full breakdown of what the data meant. And he got that through a second leak that nobody talks about. Max Perutz sat on a committee called the MRC Biophysics Committee. That is the Medical Research Council. They funded labs like King's College. Part of the funding process required progress reports, detailed summaries of what each lab was working on. In December 1952, Franklin submitted hers. She outlined her X-ray findings. She described the helical structure. She included measurements, water content, the spacing between the strands, everything she had figured out so far. It was not published. It was confidential, meant for the funding committee only. Perutz worked at Cambridge. So did Crick. Perutz gave Crick the report, just handed it over. He later said he thought it was fine because the report was not marked confidential, but it was an internal document, not public, not meant to be shared with competing labs. Crick read Franklin's entire analysis. He now had the photograph from Watson and the data breakdown from Perutz. They had everything Franklin knew, and she had no idea. Watson and Crick built their model in March 1953. They used Franklin's measurements for the helical pitch. That is the distance it takes for the helix to complete one full turn. They used her data on the position of the sugar phosphate backbone. They used her water content analysis to understand how the molecule held its shape. Every major parameter in their model came from her work. They did not do the experiments. They did not take the images. They built a model using someone else's data and called it a discovery. On April 25, 1953, Nature published 3 papers. Watson and Crick's paper was first, 1 page long. It described the double helix. It said the structure had 2 chains running in opposite directions. It mentioned that they had been stimulated by unpublished results from King's College. It did not name Franklin. The second paper was Franklin's. She presented her X-ray data, the evidence. But the way the journal arranged it made her paper look like confirmation, like she had tested Watson and Crick's idea and found it correct. The third paper was Wilkins, also framed as supporting evidence. The structure of the issue told a story. Watson and Crick discovered it. Franklin and Wilkins backed them up. That was the narrative. Franklin did not fight it. Some of her colleagues said she did not realize how much had been taken. Others said she knew but chose not to make it a public battle. She left King's College in March 1953. The same month Watson and Crick finished their model. She moved to Birkbeck College across London. She started working on the tobacco mosaic virus, a completely different project. She never went back to DNA, not once, and nobody asked her why. Franklin published 17 papers on viruses between 1953 and 1958. She built a research group. She was doing important work, but DNA was the thing that mattered. DNA was the discovery that would define the century, and she walked away from it. Or maybe she was pushed out so quietly she did not even feel it happen. That is what institutional erasure looks like. You do not get fired, you do not get banned, you just stop being part of the conversation. And eventually, you leave. In April 1958, Franklin died. She was 37 years old, ovarian cancer. She had been sick for 2 years, but kept working. The X-rays she used in her research did not have the shielding they have now. She was exposed to radiation constantly, for years. There is no way to prove the X-rays caused the cancer, but the timeline fits. She spent her career looking at molecular structures, using a tool that was slowly killing her. And the work she died creating won other people a Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded in 1962, 4 years after Franklin died. Watson, Crick, and Wilkins received it. The Nobel Committee does not award prizes to dead people. That is the rule. So Franklin was not eligible. But the three men who won never mentioned her in their speeches. Crick said her name once, in passing. He credited X-ray work from King's College. He did not say Photo 51. He did not say her technique. He did not say she had identified the helix before they built the model. Watson did not mention her, at all. Not in his lecture, not in his public remarks. He erased her completely. Then, in 1968, Watson published a book, The Double Helix. It was a memoir about discovering DNA. It became a bestseller, and in it, he described Franklin as Rosie, a nickname she never used. He called her aggressive, unfeminine, difficult to work with. He said she did not understand her own data. He implied she was holding back progress because she refused to share. The book painted her as an obstacle, not a scientist. Colleagues who knew Franklin said the portrayal was false, sexist, designed to justify what had been done to her. But the book sold millions of copies, and for decades that was the version of Franklin people knew, the difficult woman who got in the way. Franklin's notebooks told a different story. She'd concluded DNA was helical in 1952. She had measured it. She knew. But she wanted more data before publishing, because that is how science works. You do not build a theory off one photograph. Watson and Crick did exactly that. They took her one photograph and her one report and rushed a model into print. It was right, but only because they were working from her evidence. She was careful. They were fast. And history remembers the ones who publish first, not the ones who do the work. For 30 years, nobody corrected the record. Watson and Crick were in every textbook. Franklin was a footnote, sometimes not even that. And the reason is simple. Nobody with power cared enough to fix it. The scientific institutions that could have spoken up stayed quiet. King's College said nothing. Cambridge said nothing. The Nobel Committee said nothing. They had given out the prize. The story was written. Changing it would mean admitting they got it wrong, so they did not change it. Silence is easier than correction. That is how erasure becomes permanent. In 1975, a woman named Anne Sayer published a biography. Rosalind Franklin and DNA Sayer had been Franklin's friend. She knew the real story. She documented what Wilkins did, what Watson and Crick took, what the institutions allowed. The book did not sell well. It was not widely reviewed. The scientific community mostly ignored it, because the people who could have amplified it were the same people who benefited from the original story. You do not rewrite history when you are the hero of that history. Then, in 1982, something changed. Aaron Klug won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Klug had worked with Franklin at Birkbeck in the 1950s. He knew her work, and when he gave his Nobel lecture, he talked about her. He said her contribution to DNA had been erased. He used his platform, the biggest one in science, to say what others would not. That Franklin had been written out of history, that it was wrong, that it needed to be corrected. It still took 20 more years. In 2002, Brenda Maddox published another biography, Rosalind Franklin, The Dark Lady of DNA. This one got attention, reviews in major papers, interviews on television. The book became a bestseller, and suddenly people started asking questions. Why had they never heard of Franklin? Why was her name not in the textbooks? Why did Watson and Crick get all the credit? The answer disturbed them. Because it was not complicated. She was erased because she was a woman, and because the men who took her work were never held accountable. Watson gave interviews about the book. He said he regretted some of what he wrote in The Double Helix. He said calling her Rosie was disrespectful. He said maybe he had been too harsh. But he never said the central fact, that he and Crick built their model using data they got without permission, that Photo 51 was not theirs to use, that Franklin should have been credited as a co-discoverer. He apologized for tone, not for theft. And that is the part that matters. Here is what textbooks say now. Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA in 1953 with important contributions from Rosalind Franklin. That is the compromise version. It acknowledges her, but it still centers them. It still calls it their discovery. It still treats her work as support, not as the foundation. You can add a name to history without changing the story. That is what happened here. Most people still cannot name her. Ask someone who discovered DNA. They say Watson and Crick. Maybe they say Crick and Watson if they remember the order wrong. Franklin does not come up, because the narrative is set. It was set in 1953 when Nature published those 3 papers in that specific order. It was set in 1962 when the Nobel Prize went to 3 men. It was set in 1968 when Watson published a best-selling book that painted Franklin as difficult. Each decision locked the story a little tighter, until correcting it required fighting 50 years of institutional inertia. Most people do not fight that. Most people just accept the version they were taught. Franklin never knew. That is the part that keeps coming back. She died in 1958. She never knew Watson had seen Photo 51 without her permission. She never knew Perutz had given Crick her report. She never knew the model that made them famous was built on her measurements. She thought her work was hers, private until she chose to publish it. She thought the system protected that. It did not, and she died believing a lie. The structure of DNA is solved. That is not in question. The double helix is real. Watson and Crick were right, but being right is not the same as being honest. They were right because they used someone else's data. They won because they published first, not because they did the work. And the system rewarded them anyway because the system does not care how you get the answer. It cares who gets credit. And credit goes to whoever the institution decides to protect. This is not about one bad decision. This is about a structure that makes bad decisions invisible. Wilkins thought sharing the photo was fine because he thought lab data was collective property, except it was only collective when a woman produced it. Perutz thought sharing the report was fine because it was not marked confidential, except it was an internal document never meant for competitors. Watson and Crick thought using the data was fine because they were never told not to, except they never asked. At every step, someone made a choice, and at every step, the institution allowed it, because the woman whose work was taken had no power to stop it. Erasure does not require a conspiracy. It requires indifference. It requires a system that assumes men are discoverers and women are assistants. That assumes credit belongs to whoever speaks loudest. That never pauses to ask whether the story it tells is true. Franklin was erased because no one with authority thought her absence was worth noticing, and by the time someone did notice, she had been dead for 17 years. Photo 51 is in textbooks now. You can find it online, that clear X pattern. The signature of the helix. Franklin labeled it, filed it, planned to return to it. She treated it as the beginning of the work. Watson and Crick treated it as the end. That difference is everything. She wanted to be certain. They wanted to be first. History remembers the ones who are first, not the ones who are careful. And that is the structure we still live in.